forester, effectively the forester and logging engineer for the Nez Perce tribe. We're basically, I guess from the top, we are north central Idaho. Historically, you're really looking at an area that is basically north central Idaho into southeast Washington, over into basically the very western edge of Montana, and down into northeast Oregon. So as I'm kind of going to go through some of this today, this is when I was asked to present here for you folks, it was trying to take not basically too much information, let's go with that, and get it pared down to something that is actually tangible. So as I go through here, we're going to hit on some of the high points. Eric did already touch on a couple of these, but I'm going to kind of dial it in as to where it is important for, say, the Nez Perce. So from a contextual standpoint, when we look as who is responsible for managing Indian lands and why this is such a, and I'll say from, say for the Nez Perce, an issue is you got to look at it as goes, who's responsible for this and how did we end up here? And so you have programs that are true Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA programs. You have programs that are effectively at what they call a 638 contract. So the tribe would contract the responsibilities of the Bureau. It's still effectively overseen by the Bureau, but it is not a Bureau program. And then you have...
Thomas, why don't we go ahead and do some questions for Eric, and then we'll see if we can get Andrew back connected again.
Okay. So we have a little bit of technical difficulties, folks. Eric, if you want to turn your camera on and your microphone, we're going to do your part of the question and answer while we kind of get Andrew back up and running. So first one we had, Eric, is are you using wood for other purposes such as fuel, electricity, posts, etc., with your new timber program?
Yes, we are. As I said, we've done commercial sales, we've done pre-commercial, but also fuel wood, firewood, posts and poles.
Okay, how's that coming through, folks?
We have a little delay, Andrew, but I think it's going to work. Now we're seeing your slides.
Okay. So did I lose you at this slide last time?
That's where we were last time.
Okay, how far through it was I?
You had just started, so I think start again from this spot.
Okay. Well, I apologize for the technical difficulties, but here we are. Thank you, modern technology. So trust lands. So for, say, the Nez Perce tribe, when we're dealing with lands and land ownership, and all this contextually is important to kind of paint the backstory. So trust lands are lands managed for the tribe. So under our treaty reserved lands, they're effectively managed under federal regulation. So then you have allotted lands, which Eric alluded to earlier, which are effectively lands owned by an individual allottee or in shares with multiple allottees. Effectively, for a lot of folks, it's kind of easier to think of as it is you're working with a small private landowner. And while it's not just on, say, Nez Perce ground, but we may have an allotment that has one allottee, or say on the same 80 to 350 acres, I might have 400 allottees, each with different shares and share values. So you can end up with a lot of, say, very competing interests and thoughts, and it creates its own challenge. So then you also have what we call our fee lands, which is lands that were purchased back by the Nez Perce tribe and effectively managed by the tribe. And the BIA does not have any oversight on our fee land program. So to kind of bring a little bit of into focus, so the Nez Perce Tribe Reservation, effectively as of the Treaty of 1855, was a little over 17 million acres. And that 17 million acres between Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and into the edge of Montana, effectively was then reduced under the Treaty of 1863 to about 750,000 acres. Following the Homesteading Act and the allotment program, today the tribe basically of that 750,000 acres owns roughly about 15% of that. And that 15% reflects the number of acres that have also been purchased back by the Nez Perce tribe with tribal funds, and to add back to that land base. And when folks often look at this, and the question that we get asked not infrequently as we're working with other stakeholders is tribal land just on reservation? And in our case, the answer is no. The tribe owns land, I would say a significant amount of the lands purchased back by the tribe are actually off reservation, and within what they say that Treaty of 1855 or the ceded territory lands are. And they've got a pretty, I don't want to say aggressive is probably a little too strong of a word, but a very diligent plan looking to the future to say, okay, what do we need to do to pick up the right lands in the right place and try and kind of block things back up. So with that, you have a fragmented land base, you have a very broad, far-reaching geographical distance between everything. So kind of panning out with the different land bases, so trust, allotment, fee, the different ways that is then say managed, whether you're a bureau program or 638. We made that transition from a bureau program to a 638 program here about 30 years ago. So to that end, what's been probably the biggest challenge and opportunity for us is under, say, more of the bureau model, and this is a broad brush statement, but given the time I have allowed, we're going to go with broad brush. So with that broad brush statement, the Bureau's goal was to maximize, at the direction of the tribe, timber revenue. So the Nez Perce was a timber dependent tribe. And as we kind of made that transition out of, say, the late 80s, early 90s into looking more, say, at long-term stewardship, it really began a whole process of trying to think much bigger picture instead of what is the value of that tree on a truck or what is the return to the tribe. And it was about that time that respectfully, the Bureau, under the Bureau management, the tribal lands have been cut over pretty hard. And a lot of Nez Perce tribe ground, for folks that aren't really familiar with, say, the north central Idaho area, we have, it is a lot of canyon, broken, steep country, some very poor growing sites, areas that from a growing degree day standpoint are pretty short. We have some stuff that is higher elevations. We have stuff that is literally in deep, dark canyon on the Clearwater, and now stuff that is high and dry out on the Salmon River breaks. It's ground that when it burns or when it's logged pretty hard, given the choice, would really like to come back and brush, and getting a seedling reestablished there is truly an art. And to that end, for years, we're, say, under one management regime, the focus was put really hard on getting that cut out, and maybe not as much emphasis was put on reforestation. You ended up with some stands that are a long ways from what we would consider to be sustainable long-term. And as we began to look at that long-term stewardship, it kind of began to open up a series of really unique opportunities. And so if you think of it from a blank slate, how would you manage land if you knew that you were never going to sell it and money was no object? And I say money no object not because there's just money out there, it's never ending, but more of thinking of it outside the constraints of, I need to get the most out of X, whatever X may be. And so to that end, it's kind of a freeing thing to think about when you say, okay, if I'm going to pass this on to my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren, and we've been here since time immemorial and we'll continue to be here, then how do you treat this so that it is forever maintained? And so as part of that process, you're really looking to establish what are your priorities for managing that land base. And that is a very fluid thing for us. And with that comes picking the winners and losers. So key areas of importance for us is healthy, resilient forest, and it's growing the right trees. So depending on where you're at on our land base is if you cut, and I say this tongue in cheek, but grand fir grows here like a weed. If you cut down, doesn't matter what the stand is, we have a grand fir seed bank and it wants to come back in grand fir. However, where we're at, especially in that lower elevation end of things, grand fir may grow and do really well for say the first 55 to 60 years, and then it looks for an excuse to die, whether it is from root disease or bug issues or due to our fire return interval, it simply burns to the ground. So for us, it's getting the right trees in place. Um, very important to the Nez Perce tribe is restoring fire on the landscape. Also very important is basically is fish, water, wildlife, and then what is that long range? And when a lot of folks think long range, they're thinking of say a full rotation or two. We're looking on a several 100-year sort of horizon from a planning standpoint, and recognizing that timber may not be, and this is from a forester standpoint, at times a little difficult to wrap your brain around, but it's when is the other resources on the site of higher value than timber. Timber is a very critical component of it, but timber's not necessarily king when it comes time to determining, is this right for elk populations? Is this right for this list of endangered species that we're really trying hard to make sure that on this fragmented ownership, we do our best to conserve? Or are we setting the right example when we start talking with, say, other land managers, other federal land managers, as far as how we address our water and whether that is water that flows through, water that is runoff, our roads infrastructure, just there's a whole conglomerate of things. And then with all the stuff you start adding on to it, then becomes the importance of not over managing the resource. And to that end, when we start talking the over management is we're trying to get too much out of say each acre. So I can't have, let's make up some numbers, which are not entirely made up, but say I want to ensure that we have 14 snags per acre, or I want to ensure that we allow for this specific habitat for this species. But at the same time, I need to make sure that it's right for all of these. And then I also want to have, say, firewood trees, and I want to have this, and I want to have that, and revenue. And like most of you know, before you know it, you've said, I want all of these things, but there's only so much to go around. And so then it's begin to work through that process of saying, this will work, we can make this work here. And just because we don't have it on this acre doesn't mean that it doesn't exist elsewhere, say on the reserve, or that we're not picking it up better on the landscape elsewhere. So for us, it comes down to playing the hand you're dealt. So as we begin to take and look at our land base and say, okay, if we don't have to necessarily maximize timber return, and our goal is say playing that long-term game, what do we have to actually work with if we're going to take a blank slate approach? So for us, our stocking is uniformly variable. To that I mean there is nothing consistent about it. So you have very different management goals over the years, folks that have changed mid-rotation, folks that have through different means said, well, hey, well, we're going to now thin 20 years earlier than we should, or we're in an area where we have a fire return interval. In some areas, it's every 25 to 30 years. Other areas, we see a fire return interval of every 14 to 15 years. With the fragmented ownership, we've got parcels scattered basically from dead center. We're basically 200 miles east to west, 170 miles north to south. We have legacy problems. We have limited usable road infrastructure. You're in canyon lands, steep lands. You have ground that the emphasis again was made on timber, and it was not made on we're here forever. And if you're going to manage it forever, we have to have decent roads to get there. And a lot of these were dirt 2-track roads that over time through use and lack of maintenance effectively either faded away or eroded to the point that they're not functionable. So really the only two factors, if you look at it with a little bit of humor, is the ground we have is all accessible. One way or another, we can get there, and we've got a lot of it to work with. So to that end, as we're looking at some trees and some ground that's rough and it is difficult to get to, and you're in an area where the market is at times questionable, um, we have that economy of scale in our favor. So we're not necessarily trying to move that 15 acres for that landowner that has no access, that really wants the moon out of the whole thing. We have actually something to work with. And the neat thing is we're able to work the problem backwards. So if you know you've got, say, that harsh piece of ground, that tough cell to get through, what do we need to come up with? How much volume do we have to put out there? What does this picture need to look like so that we can either scale it up or scale it down, or find out what that right fit is to make it a push? So one of the examples that I've got a couple of examples that I'll run through today. So one is, say, what we call our Maloney Creek project. So it's land that was south of the reservation that was purchased back by the Nez Perce tribe in the late 80s. And they've since added to this purchase a total of about 23,000 acres in the Craig Mountains. So much of it was old industrial timberlands, and it was cut over. It wasn't reforested at the time. And to that end, it all came back in grand fir, lodgepole, basically a thicket. And some folks go, well, it's good for habitat. We've arrived at the point on a lot of this that it is thick enough that it is not being utilized by much. It's also an area that has a high fire return interval, and it's a lightning corridor. It's high, it's dry, it's a challenge. It's right on the Salmon River breaks. It's also a sensitive air shed. So every time it either catches fire or we look to put fire back on the ground in different spots, as soon as nightfall hits, it smokes out the towns of Lewiston, Idaho, and Clarkson, Washington. In total with this, we're looking at about a 1,200 acre project and some of the worst that we had to work with. So to that end, it began the process of setting up enough and saying, okay, what is this actually going to take to put a project together? And if no contractor wants to touch it, so let me take a step back here. So a challenge that we run into that's not dissimilar from a lot of folks in the Northwest is over time, as we have lost milling infrastructure, you find yourself that when you take wood to market, depending where you are, anywhere in the Northwest, you may only have one or two purchasers. And of those one or two purchasers, you may have a product that one of them doesn't want and the other's not too excited about. Where we are, we effectively have two purchasers. We have, again, one that really would prefer everything in long logs, and the other that has a pretty short list of what wood they would actually like to purchase. And then we have one outlet for pulp products. So when our markets aren't super strong, things can get pretty tight. So as we began looking at this project, we said, okay, this was the Nez Perce tribe's kind of first foray into how do we begin, after letting a bunch of wood grow for years and trying to figure out what it is that things were going to look like, into actual logging again. So as we began sorting through this, we said, okay, in this case, a lot of root rot, a lot of other challenges. If long-term you want this to be good habitat, sustainable growing trees, let's get the grand fir out of there. We made the decision to go through, do it all cut to length, short log it. A lot of the wood we have has a lot of taper to it. And so sending it as long log, you end up eating it in terms of scale. And so short log, lowering ground disturbance, increasing our season of operation. So where we are, if you're running a conventional ground-based side, you're going to get about 7 months of operation. If I'm running cut to length and running on a slash mat, I can stretch that 7 comfortably to 10. Some years with the land base we have, I can push that to about 11 to 11 and a half months of operation. And so there's some advantage to that, but that's another story. so as we began pushing our way through this, this is kind of how it started to open up. And it's getting it to a point that we've got trees that are spaced out in that 30 to 40 foot range. All this was selected so there's, okay, we want trees that are free to grow. And if we can get it to the point that it is beginning to open up and we can have it set, then we can start getting some fire back on the landscape and pushing more on that prescribed fire. So each year for us for prescribed fire, we're burning on average, depends, there's high lows and high years and low years. Average, we're in that 450 to 600 acres broadcast. There's some years where we're in that couple thousand acre range, and other years where we're in that 50 to 60 acre range, just because we don't get a weather window. But more acres that we can get treated and prepped, the more we can get fire back and really push kind of that long-term resilient sort of a landscape. So as we're looking on other problem projects, we put a project together here starting about 4 years ago that was the Lookout Biomass Pilot Project. So this is an area that is about 2,000 acres, and about a little over a third of it is steep canyon ground. But it burned to the ground in a fire back in 1968. When it was replanted, it was a whole debacle on this, but the seed came out of the Black Hills, and it was furrow planted anywhere that was flat on an 8 by 8 foot spacing. As you can imagine, if you plant pine on an 8 by 8 foot spacing in the greater Northwest and leave it for the last 40 plus years, it comes in carrot shape and tries to choke itself out. So what we did in trying to figure out what to do with it was we basically said, okay, if I can't send it, it won't make a saw log. Pulp mill really doesn't want a whole bunch of it. What can we do with it? So we looked at it as a biomass project, and then we ended up producing poles and a number of other odd specialty products out of it. But so far we're about 700 acres into the project, and it's tracking in the black. So one challenge that we run into is on, say, for our end, is we can't sell a deficit sale. So it has to pencil, it has to carry its way. We do not subsidize anything. So that is a challenge. There are some opportunities that we can do some cost sharing and move some stuff around, but it has to carry its cost and overhead costs. So this is an example as we're looking kind of mid-project, as we're beginning to sort through this. And so again, this was all stuff that was planted on an 8 by 8 foot spacing, and there was some Doug fir sprinkled throughout that came in naturally at some point over time. But again, this was a project for us that all went out cut to length. And it was small diameter stuff. We had stuff that was going to the mill or being turned into pulp that if a ton is a ton, and if we can get it on a truck, we were sending it. Stuff that was going to make great poles and hot poles in basically over in the Columbia Basin. And this has been an ongoing thing. So for us here with all this slash, again, this is basically in the Clearwater airshed, and we run into issues with if we were to try and burn the activity fuels on this. So what we do, and we look a lot of to try and get fire back, is to manipulate those fuels to get it to a point that we can get fire back on the landscape, truly at the landscape level. So say in the interest of, say, a project like this, we look to mulch all the logging slash. So in our case, cradle to grave, we can say have that ground cut, the slash treated, and everything free to grow, and that can happen in a matter of months versus say a year plus as you're waiting for slash to cure and a burn window and the liability of burning if your fuel load is high and on some of these dry sites. And so that just gives us a lot more opportunity. Now, as we roll through this, this is basically another view of that site after we've gone through with our masticators and we've logged it. And again, this is a project that now effectively is free to grow. So it'll be set. So this picture here was actually taken late last fall, and it's at a site where you go, okay, you got good winter little set on it, and then this is the same looking into this spring from just a different perspective. And so with this, as we look big picture, it's going, okay, long term, from a habitat standpoint and looking for wildlife and water and getting fire back, this is more the structure that we're after. So if I bounce forward one more, um, big picture, trying to compress a whole bunch in, along with technical difficulties, we abridged a few things, but to that end, it is a very diverse, broad-reaching land base, and the tribe, Nez Perce tribe, and I would say most of our other tribes in the Northwest are looking at a very long-term holistic management standpoint and trying to maximize those acres, whatever that use may be, water, wildlife, timber, range, and it is a puzzle and is not a one-size-fits-all situation. So I guess in conclusion, this is actually looking out over the Salmon River breaks down into Pittsburgh Landing. For those who know where that is, on the Idaho-Oregon border. And I would like to thank the opportunity for being invited to speak today.